Hello everyone, I'm Matthew Taylor, I'm Chief Executive of the RSA, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's special event. Before we begin, can I ask you to make sure your mobile phone is switched to silent? Can I also remind you this event is being recorded, so you can share the podcast and video with friends and colleagues. They'll be available in a few days' time to download from our website. We're also broadcasting live online this evening, so welcome to our web viewers, and a reminder that the hashtag is RSA Crowdfunding if you want to get involved in the discussion on Twitter. I'm going to tell you more about the event in a moment, but I want to ask you first to do a favour for me, which is that a colleague of ours at the RSA, Emma Lindley, who worked in our social brain team, died this weekend, which is a very tragic event. And just to mark her passing, because this is the first event we've had since we heard that news, I'm just going to ask you to be silent just for a few seconds while we mark her passing. Thank you. Thank you. As the Twitter handle, which I've just shared with you, RSA Crowdfunding suggests, we've drawn together a terrific panel tonight to help us mark the RSA's entry into the world of crowdfunding. At the core of the RSA's mission and purpose are our 27,000 fellows, and I know most of you are fellows. Not only do you drive the organisation's work with your support and, of course, your annual subscriptions, but we know through conversations, through surveys and the submissions that come to our Catalyst programme of small grants that fellows love to hear about new ideas and to help one another's projects to make social change happen. So we thought for some time that crowdfunding would be a really brilliant way to bring fellows together and show how fellowship has a real tangible impact on the world. We also think that an area with successful RSA crowdfunding projects would be a great advertisement for the work of the RSA and its fellowship, and we hope it will be a calling card for other potential fellows who share our values and ambitions. So we've been working on this project for some time. We're delighted to be joined this evening by a lineup of really exciting speakers to help us explore the question, crowdfunding, where next, how far, and what are the limits. So let me tell you about our four speakers. Julie Mayer founded Ariadne Capital in August 2000 to create a new model for the financing of entrepreneurship in Europe and the UK, entrepreneurs backing entrepreneurs. She's received many awards for her work and sits on several boards and government advisory panels. She was awarded an MBE for her services to entrepreneurship in 2012, and her first book, Welcome to Entrepreneur Country, was published last summer. Susan Kramer is a Liberal Democrat peer. She's torn herself away from Glasgow, and Treasury co-chair, focusing on finance and business issues with a long-standing interest in developing a framework for community banks. She became a Lib Dem MP in 1993, followed a distinguished career in banking in the US, where she was VP for Citigroup. Bobby Johnson is a journalist who's written for a wide range of newspapers and publications, including The Guardian. Last year, he launched a new website for long-form journalism, Matter, funded by a very successful Kickstarter campaign. And Ed Whiting is currently a senior program manager at Nesta, working on their Centre for Social Action. He's a former team leader of the Financial Regulation Strategy team at the Treasury and co-founder of arts-focused crowdfunding platform We Did This. In addition, Ed's an RSA Fellowship Council member who sits on the advisory group to our Catalyst programme, from which he has driven our work to set up the new RSA crowdfunding area on Kickstarter. So Ed will presumably be quite nervous because we've been building up to this for a long time, haven't we? So we've got a great panel. We're going to hear from them. I'm going to ask them a few questions. We're then going to have 6, or is it 7? I think it's 7 20-second pitches from the first set of ideas that are going up on the RSA space on Kickstarter. So in the room, there are 7 people nervously awaiting their 20 seconds of fame. And then we're going to take some questions for you, and we're going to wrap up no later than 7:15. So first of all, can you please welcome Julie Mayer?
Is it okay if I stay here?
Of course it is.
All right, great. So Ariadne Capital is a group of entrepreneurs, 62, that really backed me in 2000 to bring this model of entrepreneurs backing entrepreneurs, which was, in a way, a kind of crowdfunding or sourcing of entrepreneurs to back other entrepreneurs. And we did that in the year 2000, and nobody else had done it at the institutional level. There's always been private investor groups, but so we kind of have that in our core. And we embrace crowdfunding on our Entrepreneur Country platform. We work with groups like Crowdcube, who are a leading crowdfunding platform, and Bloom VC, because we think at that early stage, the angel stage, that the best money for you could be in Cornwall or Newcastle, but it's not necessarily the person who's at the event that you just went to. So what does digital media do but reduces the distance between you and your audience, and your natural audience for a proposition. It's most easy to find those people online. There were early examples of that. Tim Draper of Draper Fisher did something called Me VC back in 2000, but it really took until the last couple of years for this all to take off. So I think that crowdfunding is going to be absolutely massive in terms of its impact on my business, which is the financing of entrepreneurship. We have a small fund. We've backed a lot of companies over the past 12 to 13 years. But I think its implications in society are much broader than just impacting the financing of entrepreneurship. And I'd throw this out to the audience for thought and perhaps debate later, is that it really enables us at our fundamental level as a society, as a group of people, to take collective action. What more could be more important than what you care about, the causes that are near to your heart? You channel your money towards that, right? And if you think about that at a fundamental level, that's what government is supposed to do. It decides we live differently here than, say, they do in South Dakota or, wherever. Pick your country, pick your region, and so forth. Society comes together and channels its money towards a certain social economic paradigm or structure. And that's what government does. And so I think, whereas over the past 60 years, government has been that glue, that force for social action, the collective action or collective exchange has been delivered through government. I think that's really going to change. I think that we can see that we can take collective action through forces like crowdfunding and other digital media, and we can channel our money, our thoughts, our networks, and so forth. And I think that the impact on that is going to be significant in this new common sense which is emerging. Because if you fast forward, that Wayne Gretzky quote, which is, a good hockey player plays to where the puck is, but a great hockey player plays to where the puck's going. So if we fast forward 30 years and think about how important crowdfunding is in our lives today, in 30 years' time, it's just going to be like the oxygen that we breathe. It's just not going to be something new. We won't be coming to an event to talk about it. It will be everybody doing it constantly. And I think if you roll that back to the present, what that means is that there's going to be just a de facto reduction or diminishing in the role of things like government in the way that it's currently structured, because we're going to feel that we can bring about that change in our neighborhoods. I live in Earl's Court, and the people of Earl's Court are going to decide how the people of Earl's Court want to live, and we're going to channel our local money to fixing social problems, and we're not going to need to feel that we need to, elect people to go and figure it out for us. We're going to say, you know what, we can figure this out, we can do it locally. So I think crowdfunding is indeed an important subject for debate today, because it's going to absolutely change society, not just the financing of entrepreneurship.
Julie, thank you very much. Okay, so crowdfunding is going to change the world. Susan?
Well, I hope that it will. I'm very positive about crowdfunding. I think the global forecast is that in 2013, something like $6 billion will be raised through crowdfunding. Ed will know this better because he's working closely with Nesta, but I think their estimate is that within 3 years in the UK, it'll be something like £14.5 billion annually raised through crowdfunding. So this is not peanuts, this is not marginal, this is actually serious money. And the range of activities is all the way, initially I thought of it very much for environmental causes, clearly social enterprise, very much looking at crowdfunding, the arts increasingly, but also small businesses, an extremely interesting area because, as you will know with small business, not only does it have problems on the debt side, and indeed some crowdfunders can get involved in that as well. I'm thinking about people like BuzzBank who cross that barrier. But the equity layer is absolutely critical for small businesses, and we're at a point where the growth of those businesses, and you may have seen some of the new numbers coming out today, that growth is going to be significant, we'll need sources of capital and need them soon. And conventional sources do not seem to be available. We know that the banks won't provide. AIM is not capable of coping. This is going to be a very significant new mechanism. And I must say in this country, one of the things we have tried to take on is how do we then provide an appropriate regulatory framework? And the FCA has been looking at that. I think it's now 2 approved equity platforms. That's Crowdcube and Cedar. But there's a lot of caution in the FCA. And I do think we have to look at our regulator and make sure they start taking a very serious look at this. Because they need to be an enabler to make sure that it's done within a reasonably safe context with proper transparency and accountability. But I think the role of the regulator as an enabler is something that the FCA and others are now trying to sort of grapple with and come to terms with. But I want to add a note of caution. Crowdfunding is very much flavour of the month. I mean, a year ago, it'd be tough to find a government minister who knew what you were talking about. Now, every one of them thinks that crowdfunding is clearly the answer to whatever problem has just come their way, and particularly the lack of capital. It is just awful. And the problem, I mean, we may be facing excessive expectations. Although it's growing, it's still small. It's not going to answer every need. It's going to be one of a diverse set of sources, and it can't carry the burden in and of itself. And I think a couple of attempts very recently to raise crowdfunding money that haven't met their target probably are an example. You know, this is going to take time, and it's only going to be part of the picture. But as I say, it has a role to play. Also, I think the industry has to be conscious. To me, this is sort of at a turning point. It's almost like when you see a small business and then it suddenly moves up to become a medium-sized business and starts growing. It suddenly has to look at itself rather differently, because to date, most of the players in this field have been people who've been excited by the idea, they know each other, there's quite a bit of trust in the industry, it's working in a kind of known context. As this starts to grow, you're going to get a lot of new people coming into this field, and it's going to start to change the environment, and people are going to have to be careful, because a couple of rogues in this field that are going to be a setback to everybody, and it needs to be watched, which is why I think the FCA has a tough role. I'm also very keen on diversity, so I'm slightly concerned when you hear that Santander, for example, is looking at investing in something like a peer-to-peer like funding circle. So, I mean, I think we've got to watch that the institutional giants don't suddenly look at this, say, hang on, this is real, this is money, and start to begin to try and take it over. So I think it's going to be important to keep those kinds of distinctions. Again, as businesses, social enterprise get involved in raising equity, do they have the legal and accounting background and advice available to be able to do that properly? We're going to have to develop that. Are we going to develop a secondary market that might provide some liquidity that reduces risk? And how will we deal with the media? Because, as I say, at the moment, crowdfunding is the darling. There's the odd warning when you read when you read a media article. But if there are some failed, businesses fail, social enterprises fail, stuff fails, and it has to. It's part of a healthy economy. But when that happens, will the media be able to accept it rather than very superficially damn the industry as a whole? And then we've got to deal with this issue of sophisticated investors, and it's a very difficult question. Some of the, the proposals that I've seen go out quite specifically say we're only looking for sophisticated investors who can understand the risks of this particular project. And that's absolutely, I think, entirely appropriate. But it varies enormously. If you're doing this on a very small scale and it's something very local, your sophisticated investor might be somebody who lives locally, who might use it, who might know about housing in your local community, or other kinds of services in your community, or a hydro dam project in your community and local demand. So they might be sophisticated in a way that is not conventionally understood. And how do we get those people enabled to play in this arena effectively? I think that's a challenge that the regulator is going to have to take on, perhaps some sort of materiality clause. So a lot of stuff going on here. Questions too about the tax issues. You know, how do you get ISA wraparounds? All kinds of issues around with all of that that are going to make this absolutely fascinating. But I come back and say, to me, this is part of the disintermediation of the big financial institutions that we've lived with now for a generation. I think it's going to be an absolutely key player. And I'm here today very much to listen because I have to learn. And if I can make one plea to people in the audience, people on the panel, if you think there's an area where we need some legislative action or some regulatory action, please talk to me, because only if I and other people in the two houses understand that can we make sure that the framework is right for crowdfunding to grow.
Thank you, Susan. A nice balance there, I thought, between Cleggian optimism and Cablean caution.
Call me the bridge.
Thank you, Susan. Okay, Bobby.
So I just wanted to briefly share with you the story of a guy called David. We all hate our bodies in various ways. You know, maybe my nose is too big, or I'm a bit big round the middle. David hates his leg. David doesn't just dislike his leg, his right leg. He really dislikes his right leg. In fact, he dislikes it so much he tried to amputate it on several occasions. He felt his body was wrong with the leg, the perfectly healthy leg that was there. We met David a few years ago and followed him on a journey where he actually, in order to try and correct this problem he had with his body, he bought a black market operation in Asia and flew out to see a doctor and get his leg amputated. Now, in the past, the condition that David suffers from, which is called body identity integrity disorder, this was dismissed as a kind of psychological fetish or weirdness. But it turns out that neurologists now are starting to understand what's going on in David's brain. And David's brain is wired incorrectly, and his brain is telling his body that his leg is wrong, his leg is alien. So we went and followed David to tell his story. And the only reason we were able to do that was because of crowdfunding. This kind of horrific, complex, human story of a man fighting against his own body. A couple of years ago, my co-founder Jim and I were sitting around bemoaning the state of journalism and how we couldn't tell the sort of stories we wanted to. You know, big, complex, rangy things that weren't just lurid, man wants to chop his leg off. Here we've exposed the doctors who are doing this, but sort of really complex things about how the world really works. And so we decided to try and do something about it. So the first thing we did was went to Kickstarter, and we ran a campaign there. This was about 18 months ago. And we had very little awareness of what we were doing, and very little to show to people, apart from identifying a problem and saying that we wanted to fix it. It turned out lots of people thought the same thing, because we raised $140,000 in a matter of days on Kickstarter, and gathered 2,500 readers and subscribers before we'd even started. So we launched a company off the back of this called Matter. Plug, you can see it at readmatter.com. And Kickstarter was really our smoke test. You know, was something that we thought was in the public good, but also a private service that we wanted to provide. Was there a space in the market for that? And we discovered there was. We grew the company. We started publishing last year. We have won 2 awards for the stories we published, which are kind of extremely long magazine features or short books. And we actually got acquired earlier this year as well. And we were the first company that was started out of Kickstarter that got acquired. And now we're preparing to go to the next level. So we've really sort of followed this journey through. I'm telling you all of that not because I want to blow my own trumpet, although of course I do, but because I think there's very important practical lessons to learn when you're at the coalface. You know, when you're trying to build something and trying to go out and ask people for money. We'll hear a lot about the structures and the frameworks, but I think there's also a lot to be said about being there doing it. It's not, most people see crowdfunding from the outside as as viewers or even investors. But there's a lot we can learn from the people who aren't operating under theoretical conditions and assumptions. They're actually practically doing them. You know, and I get asked to give advice to a lot of people because we ran this weirdly successful campaign, like I didn't really know what I'm talking about. But it seems to me like crowdfunding offers a few really important things that we should be thinking about. And one is, you know, resurrecting the idea of patronage or micro-patronage, I suppose, you know, because you can give tiny, tiny amounts. And this is something that historically has always been there, but sort of got eroded and ripped apart by the way the mass market developed. And, you know, big products that cover everybody are more profitable. But profit isn't the only thing anyone's in it for. There's also a really important thing about turning followers into funders, turning people who are interested but don't have a way to realise that interest, you know, turning that latent value into something you can use. And that's not necessarily financial. That can also be in terms of their interest, their participation. And crowdfunding is a great beacon for that stuff. And people seem to forget that a lot. They always focus on the money, the money, the money. It's not the money, it's the relationships. And I think also we should think about crowdfunding as a potential corrective to the sort of the way that the free market distorts and warps product and perception over time. So, you know, wherever we start from, I used to work for The Guardian for a decade, which was, you know, a place which does some great journalism, as we've seen. But, you know, even there we had the same problems. You know, we had limitations. We couldn't tell the stories I wanted to tell, which is why I left and went and did it myself. You know, the free market doesn't always connect when you know, it's a choice between a mass product and a niche product. And I think, you know, I think one of the things I really want everyone to think about in the room is crowdfunding as a building block towards sustainability, not a stunt. You know, so much crowdfunding is one-off. It's, you know, somebody does something, it's a project, it launches, it happens, it's gone. But I think if crowdfunding is going to be that thing that's around for the next 20, 30 years, it has to be about a way of filling that gap that allows people to build sustainable businesses or develop sustainable ideas. So I don't actually think crowdfunding is the future, but I think it's a way to help us, give us enough time to work out what the future is going to be, to help us shape it and find out what it will look like and build it around the things that we really care about, not the things that we're told to care about.
Thank you, Bobby.
Thanks.
And then finally, Ed. Now, intriguingly, I've been told to say that although Ed may give us some insights into government thinking, he's not officially speaking on behalf of the government.
Correct.
Is that the correct health warning?
Yeah.
Good.
And I hope that's very clear. It's a very confusing place to be, so I'll try and be as simple as I can. Look, I've been on these platforms, not this one, but many like it, a couple of years ago when I was running what was a really quite small crowdfunding startup just for arts projects. And I've been in the position, as Baroness Kramer was saying, of trying to explain what crowdfunding is and saying, you know, if you give £10,000 today to an opera house, you get your name above the door. What if you gave £20 and got your name on a seat, or you got a page from the rehearsal script, or a good personalised reward? And I'm really pleased that I don't have to do it anymore, partly because it was utterly exhausting, and that there are so many other flag wavers for crowdfunding, and there are so many examples of it working. I think that's firstly really exciting. So with my site, we built it, we ran it. I was part-time at the civil service and part-time on that, which, for reference, is a really bad idea. And we funded about 50 projects. We did some work with the RSA and had a lot of fun doing it. And in the end, we decided that the kind of gazillions we needed to grow it into something truly sustainable was more than I was willing to deal with. So I went back full-time to the civil service and then since moved to Nesta. And learned a great deal about crowdfunding, learned a great deal about, as Bobby said, slogging away, trying to build something. With the help of a bit of distance from the crowdfunding world now, just a few thoughts, I think, on where we've got to and where it goes next, and would be really interested to debate this with you after we've heard from the excellent projects shortly. Firstly, the sector's growing, and it's really exciting that it's growing. And I note that last year, for instance, Kickstarter outraised the National Endowment for the Arts in the US. They raised $323 million for arts projects. The NEA only gives out $146 million. That's either a savage indictment of arts funding in the US or a fantastic achievement for Kickstarter, or both. There are a proliferation of sites in the UK, which is really interesting. I used to be part of that. I now watch others growing at different paces. Kickstarter has been quite disruptive in the UK because suddenly, only for the last, I think, about 8 months or so, projects have been able to be based in the UK and raised through Kickstarter. Indiegogo, other big US platforms are also active here, so you've got a really interesting market of small-ish but growing niche players, big US players, and it's interesting to see how they're all sort of growing and adapting their strategy. So for a crowdfunding watcher, this is a really interesting time. There are some growing pains. So a couple months ago, I think Kickstarter issued an edict saying that you couldn't give out GM crops as a reward, which I could never see coming as a problem, but in a way it's a sign of their growth that they're facing this problem. Similarly, we're learning a lot about how much people can actually raise. A fascinating sort of project that I urge you to look up afterwards is for the Ubuntu Edge phone. A month or so ago, they managed to raise $12.8 million on Indiegogo, but they chose a campaign sort of formulation where you could only keep the money if you hit your target, and their target was $32 million, which some would say is utterly crazy. Others would say quite a clever marketing ploy. I'm not sure we've quite figured out yet what the sort of optimum size of projects are, how big you can really go, and it's really interesting to see different people get into this space. Baroness Kramer's mentioned equity crowdfunding. This is a really complicated question. Higher barriers to entry. So if you're trying to fund a project through an equity crowdfunding site, it's a lot more difficult to do that because of the protection around equity and the need to know a lot more about the people who are giving money so that they're not going to give, in effect, too much on what is a high-risk proposition. As Baroness Kramer said, the regulatory space is evolving rapidly. Some would say not rapidly enough. But there's a debate there. I think it's a really interesting question, which we haven't raised so far, on equity crowdfunding, about if you're a company and go to the crowd, you're in a stroke, you're potentially adding 2,000 new shareholders to your company overnight, and you're a startup. It's a really weird space to be in. How do you develop the relationship with those 2,000? What are they in it for? What kind of a return do you get off a £50 stake in a company, say, or a £100 stake in a company? So who are the crowd investors for equity? I noted that Crowdcube, one of those two platforms, have an average investment of about £1,800, which in a sense is an enormous amount of money for, quotes, normal people to put into a website. You know, I'm not sure I would. I don't have that kind of money. Even if I did, I'm not sure I would be putting it through a site in one go like that. So there's some really interesting questions about how equity crowdfunding evolves, which we can debate. Looking to the future and wrapping up, I think what's really exciting about this space is not just about crowdfunding, it's about what we've learned about communities, and several other panel members have mentioned this already. Crowdfunding works when you have a community behind it, not just having a great idea. Kickstarter, in a sense, has created a really interesting large community. Other platforms are trying it in a more specific way around, for instance, science projects or student funding projects who we've supported through the RSA. And I think that's the thing that's going to be really interesting to test. When you have really big sort of established brands and people trying to crowdfund, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Zach Braff, who starred in Garden State, had a project recently that raised an awful amount of money, but also provoked a bit of a backlash from people saying, look, why can't you get that money elsewhere? You're an established actor. There is finance around for films. Why couldn't you go elsewhere? Similarly, someone sitting in a room by themselves without any networks is unlikely to be able to fund a project, just because you need to grow that momentum to show that a project's working. So I think, again, we're going to learn a lot more about communities and how communities come together to do things, which is why, while I'm excited about crowdfunding, I'm also excited about what they're doing in San Francisco at the minute on participatory budgeting, which is fascinating, about giving people a very direct say in how they're spending their money. I'm also excited about how communities could come together to form different investment bonds and how that may happen more in the future, so that if we, as a 200-person group, said, right, we need to build something next door here, in theory, we could put money into a vehicle as debt and get it back as a loan. I'm not sure we're quite there yet in being able to do it or bringing it about, but I think there are some fascinating possibilities. So in coming here tonight, I think crowdfunding has a really bright future. I think we're not quite at that sort of medium-sized bit that Baroness Kramer talked about, having a really well-understood ecology. But I think we're also learning an enormous amount about communities coming together. And that's just finally why I've been pushing and working a lot with the RSA to get our curated area up and running. We think there's a tremendous alignment of values, an alignment behind enterprise, an alignment behind creativity within the RSA. We want to bring that out and give people a chance to make a really big public statement about that through getting these projects funded. We might not succeed. We might fail. And that's what's kind of fun about it. But I think there's a huge possibility here for the RSA. So that's partly why I'm here tonight.
Thank you, Ed. Okay, I've got two questions for you, panel. The first one is to explore the relationship between a new mechanism and genuine institutional innovation. So this is a very different kind of example, but a few weeks ago I chaired a seminar about social enterprises that are spin-off from public services. And at that event, some research was published which showed that only 10% of social enterprises that have spun off from public services actually involve users and clients in their governance. So there was an interesting question then, which was, well, what's the point of spinning off something from public service to social enterprise if it doesn't really impact the governance, the accountability, the openness of those organisations? They just go from one kind of bureaucracy to a different kind of bureaucracy. So the question I'm interested in is how strong does the relationship need to be between crowdfunding and a kind of set of values, a kind of ways of doing things? If you think of open source computing, if you think of Wikipedia, these institutional innovations carried with them quite a lot of kind of baggage in relation to values and ways of doing things, and protected those for a long time in order to get the innovation. Or is crowdfunding just there for whoever wants to use it in order to raise money for whatever they want to raise money for, and we shouldn't get too kind of heavy about it? So, Susan, first on that question.
Well, I think it's a fascinating question because so far I think it has been very values-driven. So it's tended to be social enterprises. It's been people with very innovative ideas that they think, are out of the standard range. I haven't heard of people going to crowdfunding to open 2 standard retail outlets, or it's tended to reach to people who have an interest in thinking differently and have something of typically a sort of social conscience at work somewhere in that picture. But I can't see that you can limit it. And I do think that makes it particularly difficult from both a sort of political and a regulatory perspective, because if you allow what you do to be driven totally by the idea that this is largely social innovation that you're supporting on a pretty small scale and sort of radical marginal stuff that will later move differently into the mainstream, that you open it up, you risk opening it in such a way that mainstream uses it and uses it entirely differently. And will it be captured? That's one of my concerns. So I think we've got to make sure there's always space for the innovation.
Great. Bobby?
Yeah, I mean, I think these things exist on a spectrum. So at one end you have people who kind of break apart their businesses or their ideas and try and be transparent and connect with the people who fund them. At the other end you have people who have a much simpler, more traditional relationship. I think the people
Because you had a very radical form of governance, didn't you, involved in the funding of your...
Yeah, so for us, anyone who gave $25 or more got a seat on our editorial board. Now, we've sort of used this in different ways. We're experimenting with it to try and see what happens. But, the first thing they did was we asked them to all throw in ideas into the pot, which we sorted through. And, well, we allowed them to sort through and work out which ones were better. And so we started commissioning some stories based off the subject areas that our editorial board members were interested in. And that's proven to be... we haven't actually published any of those stories yet because writers are slow, man. But it's proven to be really interesting and a great way of involving people in the product. We've asked them to help us make business decisions. We should release a story for free. Which one should it be? Which one do you want to share with people? And little product ideas. What is it? How do we rank certain things by importance? Those all factor into it. And that's enabled us to have a really close relationship with not everybody who reads us, but a certain subset of people who want to be involved in what we do. And, I think we tend towards the slightly more radical end of the spectrum. I can't think of many editorial organisations where you would have that kind of reader involvement. But at the other end, I don't think we have to look at this, it's not that one end is good and one end is bad. It's just that everyone has different priorities and, everyone has different levels of involvement as well. Just because what we discovered was just because people gave us $25 and got a seat on the board, they weren't necessarily interested in it. It was just the amount of money that they wanted to give. And so, even if you smash apart the way that you you build your organisation and you're incredibly transparent, that doesn't mean everybody wants to be part of making the sausage. And I think actually if you look at something like Wikipedia, you know, it's a very interesting story there because, you know, Wikipedia is ostensibly open to anyone to edit, but in fact it's largely controlled by a very small group of editors who kind of go through and enact their standards. And so I think, you know, we shouldn't see this as a binary, we should see it as a spectrum.
Ed, what do you think? Do you think crowdfunding always needs to be a little bit subversive?
I think it's good when it is. I think at the minute it's both subversive and very incumbent. So you have the difference between crowdfunding campaigns that are about products and campaigns that are about ideas. And you can tell the difference. You know, you look on Kickstarter, go browse it. I'm pleased to say that none of our RSA projects are really about products. We're an ideas organisation. But you see campaigns that are about producing a video game where you get copies of the game. And you see this Ubuntu Edge phone, which is all about people getting a premium sort of reduction, on the price of the phone. So to say, is crowdfunding disruptive, is whatever, it can be, but it isn't always, particularly now. The other thing is on small versus large. Governance with a big pool of investors and a big pool of donors is really hard outside of getting people to vote on stuff. So I don't think we're there yet in figuring out how that's going to work. With a smaller group of people, in say a couple of hundred, really exciting things happen. So to give one example from when I was running my site, there was someone crowdfunding to write a travel book about walking across Europe. He raised his total, but as well as raising his total, he had about 15 people who emailed him, who had funded him, going, actually, I live in Bratislava and it's on your route. Why don't you stay in my house on the way round? And he actually cut the cost of his travel in half because he got offers of accommodation throughout the whole route. Now, crowdfunding is disruptive and it's exciting when that kind of thing happens. But for that kind of thing to happen, the crowd needs to be actually relatively small or a particular fan base, I think. So I think we should be pretty mature in trying to segment different sorts of campaigns and different sorts of platforms.
Judy?
Dana Rinkelmann, who is the founder of Indiegogo, which is the competitor to Kickstarter, I met her at a Guardian event not too long ago, and I think I tend to agree with her view that it's less about, although it is values-driven crowdfunding now, but really this is about making markets. And what drives her and what really drove the creation of Indiegogo was that she was an investment banker, although a young one, you know, when she was 23, and she was very interested in the film and the arts and so forth. But she saw so much money being spent in ways that there really wasn't a market. And that's very relevant to the venture community that I'm a part of. Because basically, you've got a couple of guys, and it typically is guys, and their hunches, right? They've been given a lot of money from pension funds, and their hunch and a bit of analysis and whether they think the entrepreneur has the chutzpah to do it, but they don't really know if there's a market there. And so what I think we're going to see is the Indiegogos and the Kickstarters and the Crowdcubes and the Seeders really testing whether or not this idea, because what is a product except a consumer insight? You think that somebody is going to buy this. You think there's a market there. If there is no market, it really ought to die, because the only thing that's going to happen is you're going to fund something that will die at some future date. So better to kill it early than allow some sort of vision to escape the bottle and so forth. So I think that role, and you know, we tend to, because we live in the City of London and so forth, we think of the market, that sounds like a, you know, City of London financial markets. The market is us. We are the market. It's not a third-party entity out there. It's a very human, social, you know, it's about civic society, really. The market for a product or services, there's good and there's bad. So I think crowdfunding is, again, just back into that fabric of the way we're going to test things and determine whether or not people want to buy what they sell. And I don't think it's going to end up being all that values-driven. It's going to be really very kind of functional in terms of testing how people, it's going to be akin to marketing.
Great. I love the implication at the beginning of your answer that investment bankers are okay up to a certain age. 23 and her soul could be saved. Is there a cut-off age beyond which people are beyond? But,
she's very cool.
Can I ask Bruce Newland, Penny Hay, Martin Webber, Steve Ralph, Chris Gray, Rick Hall and Lisa Alton to kind of go to that corner of the room and get themselves in a kind of queue while the panel answer this last question before we turn to you to pitch, which I'm going to ask. It's a hard question, and you've all kind of given answers to this in a way, but I'm going to really put you on the spot. What is the one biggest thing that could stop the momentum of this crowdfunding movement or kind of turn it in the wrong direction? Bobby, first. Why aren't the people gathering at the front of the room? Why don't people do what I'm... Oh, you're all there already? Oh, my goodness, I underestimated the brilliance of our organisational team. I'm sorry. That's all... Oh, right, I'm sorry. Okay, right, yes.
I mean, the basic one is something that undermines public confidence in you know, in small projects, scams, frauds, and we're already seeing those appear. And
is there a kind of sign that we should know that there's a kind of like, you know, when you get a letter from a Nigerian who's a millionaire, that's often a sign that...
I think the platforms are all trying in their own way to work out how to solve this problem, because it has only, I mean, weirdly, it has only recently appeared. You know, you think it's a honeypot for scammers, really, but the, you know, Kickstarter is enacting a series of rules each time it sees a problem happening. You know, it limits projects that can run, projects that can't run, or it asks people to deliver more information. I mean, I think, you know, identity verification is kind of problematic. You know, you see an interesting idea and you want to throw it some money, but who the hell are these people? You know, and that's a big problem. And that's why the most successful people often plug into networks that they've already got, because their identity is already verified and their credentials are already there.
Great. Ed, so cheating and security from, is Bobby's suggestion?
Look, I think I think the sites internally are pretty good, and they've come a long way. So our gang, who've been going up this week, have found all sorts of fun verifying the identities, have gone through an extraordinarily rigorous process on Kickstarter. So they are working incredibly hard. Look, I think if one of these sites gets hacked, you know, and their sites become out of control of the site's curators, I think that gets more difficult. You know, it's a question of trust. People lose trust in these sites. It's not going to work. Second possibility, and I'll give two answers rather than one, is if we have a big equity crowdfunding scam, which we haven't had yet, that's going to be really difficult, because that's one where people have put serious money where they're expecting a return. They haven't let go of that money. They want something back for it. If we have a scam around that, that's going to be tough.
Susan?
Well, I won't repeat what you've just said, so I'll add another one to you. I think this is going to be quite a test. When interest rates go back to normal, so I think, you know, there's the social stuff that's going on, so that probably is not return-driven, but largely intent-driven. You know, they like the cause and they like what's being done, and that, I think, can survive almost anything. But the part that is money-driven, when you get a lot of, you know, when interest rates are back to normal and people reckon they can get good returns from relatively safe investments, then that's going to be a very interesting time for this industry.
Julie, biggest danger?
Well, I think again about what Dana Ringelmann said about how important it is for Indiegogo to create that trust loop, right? So she said there's nothing, she was talking about some discussion she had with the Obama administration and how they're very concerned about regulatory frameworks and so forth. And she managed to really convince them, listen, that there is a massive self-policing loop here, right? And that's the best way to regulate anything, is to give people a part of the outcome, right? So if it fails for everybody. So then you get people to early on spot the people who would be the fraudster and so forth. So you kill it early. You don't wait until it gets to be the 8 billion fraud. You kill it when it's 180, you know, pounds or whatever. So I think, again, when the nice thing about the crowd is that the crowd has an interest in what happens to the crowd. So, and that as a model of society is not a bad model. And I can't help but thinking of Nandan Nilekani, one of the founders of Infosys. And Infosys, as you know, is one of the biggest IT firms in India, which has just created, you know, really helped to lift India into this massive power. And I said, Nandan, what was it that helped, you know, trigger the IT services industry in India? And he said, without missing a beat, he said, Julie, the government didn't understand what was going on, so they couldn't mess it up. And so I really think, and you would expect this from me, I'm sure, but I really hope that the government doesn't think that it understands it and stays out, because I think that it will solve the, you know, the Dana Ringelmanns, the founders of these crowd, or the Darren Westlakes of Crowdcube. They are so focused on making sure that there is no fraud in their system. They will make sure, far more than the Obama administration or anybody else, that there is no fraud in the system.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that. We'll be bringing you back in panel in a few minutes. So we're going to hear from the 7 projects going up in the RSA crowdfunding area of Kickstarter. Just a couple of other things to tell you before you listen to these. All 7 proposers will be going to the Benjamin Franklin room after we've finished, so you can go and speak to them more about their projects. The other thing is to announce, indeed, that the first 200 fellows, RSA fellows, who give £10 to any of these projects, we're going to match it at the RSA to turn it into £20. And I'll tell you in a few minutes about how we can kind of verify that in line with what we just heard about verification. Okay, so I'm going to tell you, first of all, we're going to hear from Bruce. We're going to hear 20 seconds or 30 seconds from each person. I want you to give them a really quick round of applause as they get up. No, wait! And that will lift them, but now make it that's a short, sharp bit of applause, and then a short, sharp bit of applause when they finish, otherwise it'll take all night. So, first of all, welcome Bruce Newlands from MacLab London.
MacLab is a place where some extraordinary technology is made available to everyone and anyone to make almost anything. People can use digital fabrication technology to make everything from jewellery to low-cost housing systems. We've done it all already in Glasgow. We want to do it in London. I would ask that you pledge to our campaign, not for yourselves, but for any young people that you know, to give them a better chance to start their own business. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. OK, please welcome Penny Hay, Artspace Bath.
Thank you. Bath needs a contemporary art centre. We need your help to help us launch a 4-day immersive creative event in order to have a proof of concept for a contemporary art centre in Bath, paving the way for bringing in international artists, local artists and making the creativity visible in Bath. Thank you.
Please welcome Martin Webber from Clear Fear Game.
Thank you. I'm here to recruit superheroes and secret agents for the Secret Smiling Society. The Clear Fear Game is a real-life social game which brings people together to complete missions, conquer fear. It's a new approach to tackling social anxiety problems. We're raising money to take the game online to allow individuals to play it. The concept has been tested with the support of the RSA Catalyst Fund in groups, and now we want to play with you. So let's clear fear together. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. As Martin said, we successfully tested that idea out with people involved in the RSA's drug and alcohol recovery work in West Kent. Just also to tell you, before Steve comes up, there's one Fellows project that went up last week, but the sponsor can't be here because of an event he had. It's led by Ashoka and RSA fellow Ken Banks, and who is charting the rise of the reluctant innovator. OK, so back to our 7, and the 4th is Steve Ralph from Maru Cinema Project. And by the way, before Steve starts, Steve's been part of our Social Entrepreneurs Network, and if you're a social entrepreneur and you're not involved in it, you should be. Steve.
Thank you. The Meru Cinema Project is about 3 things. It's about connectivity, culture and change. What we're looking to do is to take a large screen cinema, HD cinema to Meru, to support local filmmakers, to enable health and education videos to be shown to the community and to schools, and for people to do what we take for granted nearly every day of the year, which is to go to cinema and enjoy ourselves. Thanks very much.
3 to go. Please welcome Chris Gray and his Ugileo Field Trials. I hope that's right.
It's Ujalayo. It's a Nepali word. It means light. And the idea is that we can empower people in Nepal to start businesses providing electric light for people who are currently burning oil. And this is a huge for-profit business. The oil companies make a fortune. And we want to put that money back into the local communities. So in order to test our assumptions and technology, we need to buy the technology and ship it. So we need your money.
Great,
so I'll see you downstairs, yeah?
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks.
I think our screens have got slightly out of order. But anyway, this is what we're going to hear from next, which is Rick Hall at 321 Ignition. Rick.
Thank you very much. Well, as you can see, I've got an extra kind of plug by having the extra time up there. And just on the identity verification, do be careful if your working name is Rick, but your mother christened you Richard, because they don't match the records necessarily. 321 Ignition. You'll hear a lot about citizen science in the forthcoming year. But for the majority of citizens, science is hard, it's geeky, and it's not for the likes of us. 321 Ignition puts science on the high street between the bus station and the pound shop and makes it accessible, fun, and creative, and responsive to the questions that the general public want to ask. We're looking for your support. We went live half an hour ago. Our target is now £4,499. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rick. And then finally, last but not least, Lisa Alton from the Student Makers Festival. Lisa.
Our Student Makers Markets bring young, creative people together to create vibrant mini-markets within established street markets, festivals and galleries. We want to extend this programme, and we have the opportunity to create a month-long pop-up shop and youth festival of entrepreneurship in Folkestone in December, and we need to raise the money. We have a building, it's an empty shell, we need to turn it into a fabulous pop-up space. We want to create a venue for our talks and our events, and importantly a production space so that the young people that don't have facilities can come and make their work, and also a fabulous launch event to thank everyone for helping us. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Great. Well, thank you all, and thank you all for sticking to the timing. That was absolutely brilliant. And as I say, you can meet any of those wonderful people downstairs in the Benjamin Franklin room when we finish in about 15 minutes' time. So now it's open to you to ask questions of our panel around what they've been saying about crowdfunding. And I'm going to start with a question there. Wait for the microphone to come to you. Here it comes. And give us your name as well when you ask the question. If it's particularly directed at one person on the panel, tell us who it's directed at.
Hello, my name is Sofia Matveeva, and my question is to everybody on the panel. Is there a particular profile of a crowdfunder? Can you think of maybe an age, a gender, where they come from, how much they earn, and also how much are they pledging and why?
Wow, it's a big question. Okay, any other questions? Because we might take two or three. Yep, gentleman there.
Hi. Oh,
yeah, go on. No,
yeah.
Go on.
Hi, my name is Mark Dodds, and I'm working on a crowdfunding for a pub company. And I keep getting people telling me that to raise millions, 5 million, 10 million, so on, is far too ambitious, and that we should be looking to raise money to do one pub. And I just wonder if this is a ubiquitous thing with crowdfunding. People say more than a small amount is too ambitious, so don't do it.
Okay, and then I think there was someone else in this row. This is a very questioning row here.
Thank you very much. My name's Jonathan Jewell. I used to be on the London Region Committee, so yeah, I was very much involved with the RSA. I was actually interested, and this is for those probably who are willing to commit governmental answers in response. I was interested about what you were saying, Julie, right at the beginning about the direction of funding towards particular areas, and in particular stuff about how that might replace or in some way mimic the role of government and so on. You, Susan, were talking about regulation, control, and about the role of the two houses. And I guess my interest is that, in the change in behaviour that kind of activity might lead to. If this replaces or augments or in some ways discounts the way it's going to be, how is that going to be looked at? How is government going to be controlled, so to speak, or framed so that it's not, so that that's not potentially abused, used as an opportunity to step away from state services or used to further a particular agenda?
Okay, so I'm going to leave that one to you, Susan, at the end. But Abe, do you want to start on this? Do we know what do we know about the profile of crowdfunders?
Well, I mean, if you were to do an average across everyone who gives on crowdfunding sites, I imagine you'd find that they are relatively young, that they have some money but not a lot of money, that they are making donations relatively regularly, particularly if the platform has got their user journey right. I think, though, but I think there are loads of examples of people who don't fit any of that. So, you know, my grandmother really got into crowdfunding when I ran a platform, and she's very active, but she's not young. And there are plenty of examples like that. I think the one thing that brings crowdfunding people together, though, is that most of them will get onto a crowdfunding platform because they know in some way, either as a customer or as a fan or as a friend, will know the project that they're starting with. So I think the really important thing is they come with an emotional attachment. So whilst I don't think it's very easy to do demographics, I do think there's a common sort of journey to crowdfunding that people go through, and it's really important that we recognise that when we talk about crowdfunding and look at the projects, because that's why it's so exciting and so vibrant.
Well, if you were at a party, would you know the crowdfunders from the non-crowdfunders? You'd just be able to sort of sense that
we're all crowdfunders.
We're all crowdfunders.
We're all crowdfunders. I mean, I think...
And feel free to answer any other questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think the... you know, from our experience, I've spent quite a lot of time trying to understand this profile question. And I think the answer is that it's changing all the time, so you can never keep track of it. But I would say that although you might have an idea in your head of, you know, a sort of 20 or 30 something with loads of disposable income who's out there purchasing things through whimsy or funding things through whimsy. I think actually it's, in many cases, certainly in our case, you know, our average contributor was older than we thought, was a lot smarter than we thought, and way smarter than we are, and was funding us not because there is an entertainment value in it. You know, it's often you know, it's a kind of trade-off people make of, instead of spending 20 quid taking my family to the cinema or my girlfriend or something, you know, I'll spend that 10 or 20 quid on following this project and see what it does. They want to see the journey. So I think it's people who use it as a form of kind of social entertainment. I think there's a really interesting question about raising small amounts versus raising big amounts. Because I noticed all of the projects up there, I was keeping track of how much they were trying to raise. And they were small amounts, you know, £5,000, £10,000. And I think there was one of £25,000, so you're trying to raise more. Good. But there is this kind of sense of keep your ambitions very small. I think that works to an extent, but if you can't actually deliver on the idea you're trying to build, then it's worthless. And I actually think this should have been my answer to the previous question on what's the biggest danger. And the biggest danger that is people who do join the crowdfunding revolution suddenly get disenchanted because every bloody person out there can't deliver on their promises. And I think we discovered certainly that was, you know, we're still delivering on promises that we made 18 months ago to people because it's really hard. So you have to think very hard about raising money. And sometimes being ambitious is the event, you know, saying we're trying to raise more than anyone's done before is a way to bring people in, whether it's through geography and so you get local press, or whether it's through the sort of geography of ideas and you percolate throughout strata in the communities that you're trying to touch.
Julie, does size matter?
Well, I think that the way that I look at it is that there's an appropriate amount of capital to hit a milestone in each business. That's different, but what you're trying to do is to de-risk it, and back to the whole market making. You're trying to demonstrate that there's a market for what you want, whatever it is. And at what point do you feel that you have a kind of consensus or enough of a proof point? So I would say that it's natural to test with small amount of money, hit that milestone and keep going, and that it's natural, unless you are, like you mentioned, the Ubuntu thing. If you're Mark Shuttleworth and you've sold Thought to Cisco for 600 million, you go out with 38 million on your first, you know, crowdfunding because you've sold a business for 600 million. So I think that that's the, it's really about capital to a milestone. And people come, when they're raising capital outside of the crowdfunding world, people will come in and say, I'm raising 4 million sterling, or whatever they think they're raising. And you ask them why, and sometimes they really have no clue except somebody has told them they should raise 4 million sterling, right? And you say, and if you start talking about, well, what you really are trying to do is to understand your business, right? The assumptions which drive your operating model. Right now, you're starting with, does the consumer insight that you have, does that make sense? Does anybody else think like you and the product? And if you start to think, well, how much money to test a set of assumptions to get to the next de-risking point, then you think, well, that pretty much starts to give you the appropriate amount of capital to hit that milestone.
Susan, in response to the question, do you ever see a stage where government or local government says, well, we'll fund some of this, but only if you can crowdfund the remaining proportion of it, as a kind of test of citizen commitment? And of course, there are obvious then issues of equity that kind of spring out of that. But I mean, answer the question more broadly about the dangers of government using this.
Well, I mean, I think that's fascinating to, you know, as you say, when somebody proposes something, say, for example, well, I'll give you an only example in my own community. That's when a pond had collapsed and needed to be replaced, there was a decision that had to be funded. The local authority would fund half, but only if the community raised the other half. Because if the community didn't care enough about that pond, it wasn't worth putting any public money in. So I think you will see some of that, but I suspect that's not going to be mainstream. But I do see particularly local authorities saying, look, we will pay for a service, but we're going to expect somebody else to provide it. And that provider potentially could be raising its money through crowdfunding because it has an exciting, innovating, rather different way of providing that service. It might be for, supporting people who have mental health issues back into work and taking a different approach and whatever else. So it opens up, but the question is going to be, will local authorities actually make sure they pay an appropriate price for that service, and not simply to think because it's going to be crowdfunded that they can get away with playing inappropriately. And I go back to Julie's point. It is going to be absolutely crucial that when people put forward investments, they are properly structured around a proper business case, and that the funding is tied to a proper business case. And that ought to be true whether you're doing a small local project that is very much community driven, or whether you're doing something that is going to be the 5th biggest business in the globe at the end of 15 years or something.
Do you want to say one other thing?
Two very quick things. Firstly, government or local government plus crowdfunding matching happens already. Look at Space Hive for one example. Fascinating. 80% local government, 20% crowdfunding. Does that give enough for the crowd? I don't know, but look at that. Secondly, your pub question, is a number too ambitious? I think you're asking the wrong question. The question is rather, can you generate the momentum to get you far enough in that campaign to get to a wider audience and get more people behind it? There's a brilliant Kickstarter statistic that says if you get to about 35-40% in the first week or so, and I'm sure I've got it wrong, you are 80% likely to get all the way. So the question is about momentum, particularly with the donation crowdfunding. Can you build the momentum to get you there? If you can, doesn't matter what your number is.
Very good. Okay, we'll take one last very quick round of questions. I'm taking a gentleman here, take the gentleman over there, and I'll take the young guy in the middle there. Make them brief and we'll give brief responses.
Okay, I'm Barry James from the Crowdfunding Centre. Firstly, good news that the crowdfunding industry's had its first failure. It was on the front page of the FT, and we survived. From the very beginning, people have been fearing this, and it's passed. So actually, people are a lot smarter than we're giving credit for. Not necessarily all the journalists, but people are. But my real question, though, is about openness. Julie referred to this being the future, and the future is arguably open, and arguably, well, there's actually a divide between people in the crowdfunding industry, I think, between those who think of it as an accretion of the new digital open era and those who think of it as just a development on what we had before. What do you think, and how should we handle that question when we come to regulation?
Okay, and then gentleman there. Matthew, have you got a Twitter question? Oh, right, I'll come to you then as well.
I'm Richard Brooks. How dependent is the equity crowdfunding on tax relief, on SEIS and EIS? And if we didn't have EIS and SEIS, would equity crowdfunding be as successful as it's sort of being?
Okay, very good. And then back down to Matthew here, because he's got a question from the Twitter sphere.
Hi, I've got a question from Meredith Niles, who asks, how can crowdfunding move beyond popularity contests to be a vehicle for serious evaluation of investment opportunities, and does it need to?
Very good. And then finally, the guy there in the middle.
Hi there, Tom Brooks. My question is, does anyone on the panel see a kind of a juxtaposition, as it were, forming between social entrepreneurs and their more altruistic objectives and the profit objectives of a social entrepreneur compared to the social objectives the crowd sees? Does anyone see a sort of juxtaposition forming between? Is that clear?
Okay, well, we'll find out in a second whether it's clear, because the panel are going to kind of just choose one of those points or one point that you want to make in closing panel, and I'm going to start with Bobby.
I knew you were going to do that.
Oh, sorry.
Because I don't really have any good answers.
Okay. Just say something.
Well, I was going to say on the equity crowdfunding question, I don't believe very strongly in equity crowdfunding, because I think the people who are going to use it are the people who are trying to use the levers they've got as existing investors already, and they see this as somehow a beneficial thing, for them financially, and that's fine for them. But I kind of see this as, it's almost not part of crowdfunding. It's an alternative investment vehicle, of which there are many, of which there are social bonds. There are lots of different ways we can look at it. And I kind of think you know, it's so reliant on the wider infrastructure of financial services and regulation that you pull one part out of that and the incentives fall apart. So I'm not an expert, but I don't like it particularly.
Okay. Good. Julie?
Well, I think it's an interesting point because, you know, there's a lot of, you know, SEIS and EIS, this is good, you know, tax incentives. I'm not sure that people should be investing this kind of stuff for tax benefits. I think there's actually quite a few people that don't make money precisely because they get ordinary shares and they don't know how to invest to protect themselves. I was struck by the Jeff Lynn of Cedars, who's done a lot of work thinking about the positive architecture for investors in early stage companies. And I think it's a little bit more complex than just giving them a tax incentive. So I just make a note that I think, you know, the people who win are the people who structure industries. And Jeff is a very smart guy. You know, him, Darren Westlake, and so forth. The other point, though, is kind of interesting because if I interpret where you're going with your question, and I have to admit that I have a bias here, is that, and it's kind of what I would like to believe, but it's not, time will tell, is that we will put our money into the things that have a greater good. I believe that most people are good and most people actually implicitly want something positive to happen. Not everybody believes that, but I do. And so it's interesting, we were very early involved in ZOPA, which is, you know, in 2005 was a different animal than it is in 2013. Other people have put money into, say, Wonga, right? It's a choice there. If you could crowdfund Wonga, would people do that, right? So is there a greater good, and is there a crowd-funded Wonga model? And it just makes you think about where people put their money and the kind of where's it all going, right? Because Wonga is amazingly successful, but ZOPA actually is tied to this kind of crowdfunding, which I think is also a very strong driver of human behavior. So time will tell.
Susan, pick out a point.
Well, I just love the idea of a crowd-funded rival to Wonga. I mean, this could be really potentially interesting. Well, I know that would be interesting to give it a trial. I bet you would get a lot of people in the Church of England, with the help of the Archbishop, to get behind something like that. That actually has some real potential. Store that one.
I think you might have just written a bit of the Liberal Democrat manifesto, Julie, so well done for that.
Entirely separate. But I mean, you're talking about whether or not social entrepreneurs are more biased by producing profits or by serving the community. I mean, I don't think it's much impacted by crowdfunding, except that I think they have to be very clear when they go to seek money from the crowd, what their priority is and what that balance is, and deliver on it. I think this is something that was said earlier. You have to deliver on the promise that you make. So I think it's reasonably neutral, the crowdfunding element. Perhaps it is a good discipline in the sense that if you can't raise money that's, you know, from the social sort of, with the value side, of the social impact side of social enterprise embedded in it, then you might get tempted to go to people who are only interested in the profit return. So in a sense, I imagine it's quite helpful. On EIS and SCIS, I haven't looked at those numbers to see how deeply embedded they are, so I can't give you an intelligent reply on the numbers. But I do know from talking with various colleagues in government, both of those projects are seen as being very important in channeling additional monies into both social impact investment and into new enterprise. So those tax breaks are having an impact. And since equity crowdfunding is targeted on exactly that same arena, it seems to me there is a good partnership there. But I can't see government withdrawing it because it meets government objectives. No matter what colour of government there is, we need to build small business and we need to build social enterprise.
Ed, one last line.
Right. I agree with so much what people said, and Jeff and Darren are brilliant. EIS, you look at Crowdcube's stats, I looked at them last year, it helps, but it's not the only thing, so I wouldn't say dependence right. Coming back to the question about openness and development, so I briefly also, Meredith on Twitter, it's not just a popularity contest. You'll see breakthrough ideas coming all the time. The key thing is, how do you spot what are the breakthrough ideas, and how do you spot what are the crowd getting behind someone who's their friend? Spend a bit of time on Kickstarter. Yeah, I think you sort of get there in the end. Finally, on openness and the development of of how openness works. The value stuff about crowdfunding is really important, and it is about communities, it is about people coming together. So back to the RSA is what we're trying to do here, but that is why crowdfunding works and why it's exciting, whether it's equity or debt, however you do it. So the developments I want to see, the stuff that happens in the future, must be about communities and deepening relationship within communities and between communities and people doing stuff. And I think it's a tremendously direct route to get people to do more stuff, which is good.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So I encourage you all to hang around a bit longer, go and have a drink in the Benjamin Franklin room, which is immediately underneath this room. Don't burrow through the floor, though. There are stairs. You can back a project by downloading the Kickstarter app, which is on the slide behind me. So it says here. I hope it's true. As I said, the first 200 fellows who back projects with at least £10 will throw in another £10. If you want to claim match funding, just share a tweet with hashtag RSA crowdfunding or a Facebook update on the RSA group when you backed a project, and so we'll know it's you and we'll know to match it. I want to just finish with some brief thanks to people who've really helped us out in getting to the point that we are today in launching this RSA area on crowdfunding. Ed Whiting, in his role as RSA Fellowship Council member, has put in a great deal of time, an enormous amount of time. Then to fellows who've advised us for the whole process and helped fellows build their pitches. These include Barry James of the UK Crowdfunding Centre, Brian Zhengzhang at Cambridge University, Jonathan Lister, and Wan Gera. I hope I pronounced all of those correctly. So thank you all for making this possible, and also to our own Alex Watson, who's been leading on this within the RSA. Thank you, Alex. Please then finally join me in thanking our fantastic panel tonight, Julia Mayer, Susan Kramer, Bobby Johnson, and Ed Whiting. Thank you.